Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're going to be talking about something that a lot of people think is pretty much settled, the sexual revolution, but is it really? What if we told you there's this growing argument that it has had some unintended consequences, particularly for women?
Yeah, it's really fascinating how, we often view historical events through a single lens.
Mm.
But as time passes and new perspectives emerge, sometimes these events can be seen in a whole new light.
Exactly, and that's what we are seeing here today. With the sexual revolution and helping us kind of unpack this topic is a journalist and author, Louise Perry, and her book is called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution.
Yeah, she really throws a wrench into some conventional wisdom.
Yeah.
We'll be drawing insights from her Big Think interview, where she really breaks down her arguments in a clear way.
Yeah, in a really compelling way.
It's really interesting, actually, Perry's own journey. She started out, like many of us, fully on board with the standard narrative of the sexual revolution as progress.
Right.
But something shifted for her.
Absolutely. And it seemed like it all started during her university years. She actually describes it as these dominoes starting to tumble.
Yeah.
And that's what ultimately led her to question, everything she thought she knew.
Yeah, and it culminated in this book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, which has been making some waves.
Absolutely.
Now, whenever you hear someone, critiquing the sexual revolution, there's this immediate kind of knee-jerk reaction to think that they want to return to the 1950s.
Right, or they're advocating for some Handmaid's Tale type scenario.
Yeah, like it's got to be one or the other.
Yeah, exactly. But Perry makes it very, very clear that that's not what she's about at all.
Yeah, she pushes back against this kind of simplistic binary, that it has to be either complete sexual permissiveness or a theocratic society.
Right. And she says that there is a whole spectrum in between, and that's really where this conversation needs to happen.
Yeah, that's a crucial point that she makes. So where does she suggest that we start? What's the key to understanding her perspective? Well, for Perry, the driving force behind the sexual revolution's lasting impact is the birth control pill. It's not just about contraception. It really changed the game.
Okay, so we all know the pill is a big deal, but I am kind of curious. Why does Perry see it as so central to her argument?
Well, think about it. Before the pill, women's fertility was this, like very visible biological reality. It shaped their lives and societal expectations. But the pill allowed women to control their fertility, but in a way that was invisible to others.
So it essentially decoupled sex from reproduction, which had really never been possible before. I mean, it really was like a technological revolution that reshaped human relationships.
Exactly. And this all coincided with all these other societal changes. We had the rise of labor-saving technologies like washing machines and central heating, all these modern conveniences that, lessen the burden of traditional domestic labor.
So women had more freedom to make choices about their lives, including how they approached sex and relationships. But Perry's argument is that this also has potential downsides.
Yeah, she argues that these shifts, along with the pill, create this whole new social landscape and new incentives for women to kind of adopt these traditionally male sexual behaviors.
That's what kind of things?
We're talking about things like casual sex, increased interest in pornography, and being more willing to experiment sexually.
So basically mirroring what we see as the male norms. But is that not empowering?
Well, that's how we've always seen it.
Yeah.
It's like this empowering thing. But Perry really questions this. She argues that this shift may not actually serve women's interests in the long run. And she uses Sex and the City as a prime example. Do you remember that scene in the very first episode where the main character has purely physical sex with an ex and describes it as having sex like a man?
Oh, yeah. And she feels powerful and alive. It's portrayed as a very liberating experience for her.
Exactly. And Perry's point is, this can be a misleading narrative because it sets up this expectation that women should strive for this masculine style of sexuality, even if it doesn't actually resonate with them.
Yeah, I am starting to see where she is going with this. It's like we've told women that they need to be more like men to be liberated. But what if that's not the path to genuine fulfillment?
Yeah, that's the core of her critique. And to fully understand it, we need to delve into this concept of sociosexuality, which is a key part of Perry's argument.
Okay, let's unpack that. What exactly is sociosexuality, and how does it factor into this discussion?
So sexuality, it's about your interest in sexual variety, not simply your sex drive. Someone with high sociosexuality might be more open to casual sex, and exploring a wider range of experiences with different partners.
So someone with low sociosexuality would be someone who prioritizes monogamy and commitment.
Yeah.
But how does this tie back to the sexual revolution?
Well, Perry highlights that on average, men tend to exhibit higher sociosexuality than women.
So there's this gap.
Yeah. This difference creates what she calls the sociosexuality gap.
And this isn't just some abstract concept. This plays out in the real world.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Think about dating apps. Often, the most desirable men have way more options than they could realistically pursue, while many women find themselves competing for the attention of a smaller pool of men.
So how does Perry connect this sociosexuality gap to her critique?
That's what we will pick up. In the next part of our deep dives,
Yep.
we're going to explore how this difference in sociosexuality plays out within existing power structures, and why Perry believes it creates a context where women might actually be more vulnerable to exploitation.
Well, that sounds pretty interesting. So we will see you in part 2.
So we were talking about this sociosexuality gap
Mm-hmm.
and how it plays out in the real world, like you were saying with the dating apps.
Yeah.
And it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It plays out within these existing power structures. And that's where Perry's critique gets really interesting.
Yeah, I'm all ears. So what's the connection between the sociosexuality gap and power dynamics, especially when it comes to men and women?
So Perry's argument is that when you have a system with these inherent power imbalances, and let's face it, those imbalances still exist between men and women in many areas of life, simply granting greater freedom within that system can actually lead to exploitation.
So it's not about freedom itself, but who benefits the most from that freedom
Right.
when the playing field isn't level.
Exactly. And she uses this really powerful analogy to kind of drive this point home. She says, freedom for the pike is death for the minnows. It's a quote that's originally about economics, but she applies it to sexual dynamics.
Okay. I like that analogy. Can you elaborate on what she means by that?
She's saying that if you give more freedom to those who already hold more power, in this case men, due to this higher sociosexuality and, societal advantages, it can really come at the expense of those with less power.
So the minnows,
The minnows, exactly.
the ones who are more vulnerable.
Yeah, and this is where Perry's feminist perspective really comes into play.
Okay.
She challenges this idea that feminism should simply be about encouraging women to be more like men sexually.
So embracing casual sex and hookup culture?
Yeah, exactly. But she argues that a true feminist approach should be about protecting women from harm. And that includes harm that can arise from these power imbalances in the sexual realm.
So instead of trying to close the sociosexuality gap by pushing women to be more like men, she's saying we should be encouraging men to adopt a more female-centric approach to sex.
Right, it's a very thought-provoking idea.
It is.
She believes that. Unwanted sex is a far greater harm than sexual frustration, and that we need to shift the focus away from simply maximizing sexual freedom for everyone and towards creating a sexual culture that's truly equitable and safe, particularly for women.
But how do you actually achieve that? I mean, persuading men to have sex more like women, that's a pretty radical concept. I mean, have you ever heard that before?
It's a very radical concept. It's one of the most challenging aspects of her work. And she doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but she does offer some alternative solutions for bridging this gap. She explores a range of possibilities.
Yeah.
From promoting healthy relationships to challenging, harmful gender stereotypes. But there's one approach that she specifically rejects, and that's prostitution.
Why does she reject that?
Well, the argument is that, if men have a higher sex drive, we should provide an outlet for that desire.
Right.
But she sees prostitution as inherently exploitative and harmful to women. She argues that it reduces women to commodities to be bought and sold for men's sexual gratification.
So that makes sense, given her overall argument about, these power imbalances.
Exactly.
So true equality can't exist if one group is constantly profiting from the exploitation of another.
Exactly.
So if prostitution isn't the answer, how do we address this mismatch in a way that doesn't perpetuate harm?
It's a tough question.
Mm-hmm.
She doesn't have like a magic bullet.
Yeah.
But she does highlight the importance of open and honest communication between men and women about their needs and desires.
That seems like a pretty good starting point. I mean, if we can't even talk openly and honestly about it, how can we create a more equitable and fulfilling sexual culture?
Right. It's about moving beyond the assumptions and stereotypes.
Yeah.
And really listening to each other, acknowledging that, men and women might experience sex differently and have different expectations.
So embracing those differences rather than trying to erase them.
Yeah.
And maybe that kind of thinking, that we need to be gender neutral in our approach to sex,
Hmm.
has actually backfired
Right.
and led us down a path that hasn't really been beneficial for women.
Exactly.
Yeah, her perspective is definitely prompting me to rethink some of my assumptions about the sexual revolution
Yeah.
and, its impact on our lives.
Yeah, I think that's the power of engaging with challenging ideas like Perry's. It pushes us to examine our own beliefs
Mm.
and consider these alternative perspectives.
So what are some of the key takeaways that we can glean from her arguments, especially for someone who's trying to navigate this complex landscape today?
Well, I think one of the most important takeaways is that the sexual revolution, while undoubtedly a significant moment in history, it may not have been the unqualified victory that's often portrayed as. There were trade-offs, there were unintended consequences, and those consequences need to be acknowledged and addressed.
So it's not about saying that it was all bad, but that there's more to the story than
Yeah.
just progress and liberation.
Exactly. I think another takeaway is that we need to be more critical of this idea that men and women should approach sex in the same way. Because Perry argues that this kind of thinking can be harmful, as it ignores the reality of the sociosexuality gap and the potential for exploitation that exists within that dynamic.
Yeah, that's a really crucial point. It's not about denying women's agency or desire for sexual freedom, but about recognizing that true equality requires us to take those differences into account and to create a context where women can express their desires safely and authentically.
Absolutely. And I think a final takeaway is that we need to be more intentional about the kind of sexual culture we want to create.
What do you mean by that?
It's easy to get caught up in the prevailing narratives about, sex and relationships. But Perry's work really challenges us to step back and ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want to live in?
One where sex is a source of joy and connection, and not, exploitation and harm.
Exactly. And that requires us to be honest with ourselves about the power dynamics that shape our relationships and our society as a whole.
Yeah, I really appreciate you guiding me through these complex ideas. Her work is definitely prompting a lot of reflection for me.
Me too. It's not always comfortable to confront these kinds of truths, but I think it's essential if we want to create a more just and equitable world.
So where do we go from here? What can we do as individuals to help bring about this shift in thinking?
I think the first step is to continue having these conversations. Talk to our friends, our families, our partners, raise awareness, challenge the status quo, support organizations that are working to promote healthy relationships and combat sexual violence.
So it's not just about intellectualizing these issues. It's about actually taking action
Exactly.
in our own lives to create change.
It's about being open to learning and evolving our own understanding of these issues. Her book is a great starting point, but it's just the beginning of the conversation.
Okay, so there is a lot more to explore and unpack here. So for our listeners who are interested in diving deeper, what resources would you recommend?
Well, in addition to Perry's book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, there are tons of other books, articles, podcasts that offer different perspectives on the sexual revolution and its impact. And it's important to, engage with a variety of viewpoints and form your own conclusions based on the evidence.
So don't just take our word for it, or even Louise Perry's. Do your own research, have those tough conversations, and be willing to challenge your own assumptions.
Yeah, and remember, this is a journey, not a destination.
Yeah.
This conversation about sex relationships, equality, it's constantly evolving.
So stay curious, stay engaged, and keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
Before we wrap up this deep dive, I would love to hear your thoughts. What really resonated with you from Perry's arguments?
That's a great question. What really struck me was her point about how the narrative of having sex like a man can be misleading. Like, I never really considered that it might set women up for disappointment or even harm.
Yeah, it's presented as this empowering ideal.
Yeah.
But as we were discussing, Perry argues that it can pressure women to conform to a model of sexuality that doesn't actually work for them.
And it also overlooks the fact that men and women might experience sex differently, both physically and emotionally. It's like we have created this one-size-fits-all approach to sexuality. And, maybe it's not working for everyone.
Yeah, her work is all about challenging those oversimplifications and encouraging us to think more critically about these issues.
It definitely makes me wonder if we've been too quick to embrace certain aspects of the sexual revolution without fully considering the potential downsides.
Yeah, and it's not about rejecting progress or advocating for a return to traditional values. It's about acknowledging that there can be unintended consequences to any social or cultural shift.
So if we accept that the sexual revolution has had both positive and negative consequences, what does that mean for us going forward? What kind of sexual culture should we be striving for?
That is the million-dollar question. And Perry doesn't offer any easy answers. But she does give us this framework for thinking about these issues.
So less about specific solutions and more about prompting us to ask the right questions.
Exactly. What would a truly equitable and fulfilling sexual culture look like? What values would it be based on?
Yeah, that's a powerful question. It challenges us to imagine something better.
Yeah, something that works for everyone.
And it requires us to have honest conversations about power, desire, and consent.
Creating a culture where everyone feels safe and respected.
I appreciate that Perry's work doesn't shy away from those tough conversations. It
Yeah.
can be uncomfortable to challenge our own assumptions and beliefs, but it's essential if we want to create real change.
Absolutely, and it's a journey we all need to be on, men and women alike. This isn't just a women's issue, it's a human issue.
That's such a crucial point. We all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable sexual culture, whether it's challenging harmful stereotypes, supporting organizations working to combat sexual violence, or simply having these open and honest conversations.
Yeah, every action counts.
And it all starts with being willing to question the narratives we've been told about sex and relationships.
Examining our own beliefs and biases.
Thank you.
And being open to new perspectives.
Well, the case against the sexual revolution is definitely a great place to start.
I agree. And I think it's important for anyone who considers themselves a feminist to really engage with her work.
It's given me a lot to think about.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we encourage you to continue exploring these ideas. What resonated with you? What questions or challenges do you see? And what does a more equitable and fulfilling sexual culture look like to you? Keep those questions in mind as you navigate this complex and ever-evolving landscape.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a really thought-provoking journey. Until next time,